Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one in particular would lead towards a lawsuit being filed by the victim's family against a company and the cave owner. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On May 5th, 1994, the morning air was crisp as Susan Hanley, 65, stood with a group of fellow adventurers in the dense forests of West Virginia. The group had gathered for a guided wild caving expedition, an adventure promising rugged terrain, underground rivers, and the breathtaking beauty of Norman Cave. It was a diverse group, some seasoned cave explorers, others beginners drawn by the thrill of the unknown. They had spent the morning going over basic safety instructions, how to traverse slick passages, the importance of staying close to the guide, and the general plan for the route. The trip was expected to last several hours, culminating in a visit to one of the cave's stunning waterfalls before they made their way back. As noon approached, they secured their helmets and headlamps, checked their gear one last time, and stepped toward the gaping entrance of Norman Cave. Sunan adjusted her helmet as she stood with the rest of the group outside the mouth of Norman Cave. She had no clue that this journey of hers would eventually lead to a huge lawsuit being filed by her family in upcoming days. The commercial caving expedition was led by 50-year-old guide Danny Gillespie, who had promised an adventure into the dark, winding passages of the subterranean world. The group entered the cave and navigated the initial sections. The entrance tunnel was wide and welcoming, with smooth limestone walls damp from groundwater seeping through the rock. As they moved deeper, the ceiling lowered, forcing the cavers to duck under protruding formations. The air grew colder, the silence pressing against them like a heavy weight. Approximately 600 feet, 183 meters into the cave, the passage began to narrow, funneling them toward a more challenging section, a traversable ledge running above an underground stream. Water gurgled below, echoing through the chamber. The only way forward was across the ledge, a precarious route that required careful footing. The passage was dimly visible by the lights of those ahead. Danny Gillespie, the guide, had moved ahead, busy setting up his camera to capture the rugged beauty of the cavern. The group followed cautiously, stepping along the slick rock, some pressing their hands against the walls for balance. Susan, near the middle of the group, took her turn stepping forward, watching where others placed their feet. She crossed the Ligdi just above the waterfall. Down below, she could hear the crashing water and feel the moistured, earthy scent. The adventure deep inside the cave felt surreal at the timber. She was lost in the moment while making her way ahead. She believed she was following the correct path. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Then, in a single misjudged moment, she veered slightly left, toward an opening that she hadn't noticed. It was a small passage. As Susan stepped forward, her boots suddenly met empty air. Before she could react, she was slipping, her weight pulling her forward into the hole. Instinctively, she twisted her body, trying to catch herself, but the slick walls of the opening provided no grip. She plunged downward, feet first, gravity working against her favor in the confined space, accelerating her fall like a funnel. The cold air rushed around her as she plummeted down the 27 feet, 8.2 meters slope, her body tumbling chaotically. Panic surged through her. She reached out, fingers scraping against the jagged rock, trying to slow herself. But her attempts only made things worse. Her body twisted awkwardly, causing her to lose what little control she had, and SBD rolled down in circles. The tunnel angled downward steeply, and as she slid, her helmet slammed into the wall, jolting her vision with bright flashes of pain. Her shoulders banged against the narrow walls. Then her left leg struck a protruding rock, a sharp snap echoing through the tunnel as pain exploded up her limb. Then, in an instant, the passage opened into a void. She fell. Her heels struck the rocky floor below first, the impact sending a shattering force up through her legs. The bones in both feet crushed instantly, the shock racing up to her fractured leg. The momentum threw her forward, and she slammed onto her side, her torso absorbing the remainder of the fall. A sickening crack vibrated through her spine as multiple vertebrae gave way under the force. Darkness closed in at the edges of her vision, the sound of rushing water roaring nearby. She was half conscious, floating in a haze of agony. The icy water of the underground stream lapped at her legs, numbing them almost instantly. The current was weak, but the confined space where she had landed meant that her body was partially wedged between the walls of the narrow stream bed. She was in a sideway position, and now the problem was not just to fight through the pain, get freed from the stuck position, but also to make sure she keeps her head up enough so that she doesn't drown. She tried to move, but every shift sent waves of pain through her spine and legs. Above, the group had erupted into chaos. Someone shouted her name. A caver scrambled toward the ledge, peering down into the hole she had disappeared through. Light beams danced along the rocky edges, illuminating the churning water below. A man from the group carefully made his way down the steep passage, using his arms and legs to brace himself. When he reached the bottom, his headlamp revealed Susan's crumpled form, half submerged in the stream. Blood ran in thin rivulets down her face, and her breathing was shallow. He asked for help, so a few more came down. They used whatever tools they had to break away the walls of stream bed and create space for her to move. The rock holding her were weak and brittle since they were underwater for maybe years. The men dragging her out of the narrowest section, pulling her onto a small dry ledge above the waterline. Every movement drew sharp gasps from her as broken bones shifted beneath her skin. Meanwhile, above, Gillespie had realized the severity of the situation. He turned and rushed back toward the cave entrance, moving as quickly as possible over the rugged terrain. His only option was to get out and call for help. Outside the cave, dusk had settled over the forest by the time Gillespie emerged, breathless and soaked with sweat. He radioed for emergency assistance, setting into motion what would become an exhausting, high-risk rescue mission. It took several hours for the first wave of rescuers to arrive, 40 in total, including paramedics, experienced cave explorers, and search and rescue specialists. With medical equipment, ropes, and stretchers, they descended into the cave, fighting against the cold and the narrow confines of the passage. When they reached Susan, she was barely conscious. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue. A medic crouched beside her, checking vitals. Realizing that she was hypothermic, they needed to warm her fast. They wrapped her in emergency blankets, but the damp air made every attempt at preserving body heat difficult. The team splinted her broken leg and immobilized her spine, knowing that moving her the wrong way could make her injuries worse. Then came the hardest part, getting her out. The narrow bypass passages made carrying a stretcher nearly impossible. In some sections, the rescuers had to maneuver her through tight squeezes, where the walls barely allowed room for a single person. The confined spaces forced them to pass her along in a slow, agonizing relay, inch by inch. Hours dragged on. The rescuers fought exhaustion as they worked in the near-freezing conditions, their bodies aching from the strain. The dampness seeped into their clothes, and their fingers went numb as they gripped ropes and braced against jagged rock. By midnight, they finally neared the entrance. The final ascent was grueling. Lifting her out of the cave required a coordinated effort with pulleys and raw strength. When she was finally pulled into the open air, the team collapsed in exhaustion, their faces streaked with mud and sweat. An ambulance waited nearby, its lights flashing in the darkness. As they loaded her inside, she drifted in and out of consciousness, the voices around her fading into a blur. Recovery was long and brutal. Susan's injuries left her with permanent mobility issues, and the trauma of the fall haunted her. But as her body healed, her anger grew. She believed the accident was the result of negligence, that the guide had failed to properly mark the dangerous passage, that the cave should have been better regulated. Her family believed in her, and they filed a lawsuit against Danny Gillespie, the commercial cave company that had advertised the wild caving excursions, and the owner of Norman Cave. The legal battle stretched on for months. The National Speleological Society intervened to assist in the defense of the cave owner, arguing that he had no knowledge of the tour or Gillespie's activities. Eventually, the cave owner was dropped from the case. At trial, the jury deliberated over the evidence. While they acknowledged that Gillespie had some responsibility, they determined that Susan herself was 70% at fault for the accident. She had followed the wrong path and had failed to recognize the risk. No damages were awarded. The case set a precedent for commercial caving operations. Safety protocols were re-examined, guides became more vigilant in marking hazards, and Norman Cave remained a reminder of the thin line between adventure and disaster. As for Susan, the cave had taken something from her, her mobility, her sense of security. But it had also given her a deep respect for the unforgiving nature of the underground world. Some places are meant to be explored, but they never guarantee a way back. This second story is really heart-wrenching to watch, as close friends stick together in a desperate bid to save one of their own, while keeping their emotions in check. George Lennon had always been drawn to the depths of the earth. A company director by trade and a DJ by passion, his true love was caving. Since his first dive into a Mexican cenote in 2014, he had dedicated years to mastering the art of cave diving, navigating some of the UK's most challenging subterranean systems. Known within the caving community as cautious and reliable, George was the kind of man who planned every descent meticulously, ensuring every risk was accounted for. On November 6, 2021, George set out with his two close friends, Melissa Bell and Mark Berkey, for a challenging but familiar exploration of Ogof, Ffynnon, or the Black Well Cave in southern Wales. It is the deepest cave system in the UK, stretches over 31 miles with a vertical range exceeding 900 feet or 275 meters, forming a vast labyrinth of interconnected tunnels, chambers, and subterranean rivers. The cave is divided into three main sections: OFD-1, OFD-2, and OFD-3, each presenting unique challenges. The entrance, located near Penwilt in southern Wales, leads into a steeply descending passage that quickly demands precise navigation. One of the most treacherous areas, the Upper Smithy, is notorious for its unstable rock formations and sheer drops, making it a hazardous crossing point. Deeper into the system, the main streamway carves through the cave, its fast-moving waters shaping the terrain and rendering certain routes impassable after heavy rainfall. The cave also features numerous narrow crawlways that force into tight, claustrophobic spaces, as well as vertical shafts requiring ropes and climbing gear to navigate safely. Given its immense complexity and ever-changing conditions, Ogof, Ffynnon is a place where precise mapping and expert navigation are not just tools of exploration, but essential lifelines. One wrong step or miscalculated turn could mean disaster. The group's plan was straightforward: a 6-hour descent and ascent, timed to return for a fireworks display at the South Wales Caving Club that evening. Before entering Ogof, Ffynnon, George, Melissa, and Mark conducted a final gear check. Their helmets, fitted with LED headlamps and backups, were secured, while harnesses and ropes were double-checked for stability. They wore reinforced caving suits, knee pads, and gloves to protect against rough surfaces. Each carried a dry bag with essentials. Waterproof maps and compasses were packed for navigation, and communication devices were tested. With everything in place, they exchanged a final nod, ready to descend into the depths. Rain had fallen steadily throughout the morning, soaking the terrain and rendering the cave's entrance slick with moisture. Still, the trio pressed on. The first hour of their descent was routine: calculated steps, deliberate movements, the familiar rhythm of careful navigation through a cave system that demanded absolute precision. As they moved deeper, the environment grew treacherous. The cave walls, usually offering a solid grip, glistened with water, and the floor became alarmingly slick. George noted the change, but remained confident in their ability to proceed. However, as they reached a particularly narrow opening, it became clear that the conditions were worsening rapidly. The three made the difficult but prudent decision to turn back. Their return journey required them to cross the Upper Smithy, a section infamous for its instability and sheer drops. Melissa and Mark went first, picking their way carefully across the slippery, uneven rock. They reached the other side safely, turning back to watch as George followed. He moved cautiously, testing each step before committing his weight. The floor beneath him was unstable, a thin crust of rock covering a void. He felt it shift slightly but pressed forward. Then, with no warning, the ground beneath his feet crumbled away. George plummeted into darkness. 30 feet or more than 9 meters below, he landed with a sickening impact on a jagged outcrop of rock. The force of the fall knocked the wind out of him, but he remained conscious. Agonizing pain surged through his body. His jaw was shattered, his ribs cracked, his right leg twisted unnaturally. Blood oozed from a deep wound on his face, pooling beneath him. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a sharp burning sensation. His spleen had been lacerated. He was broken, unable to move, and alone in the abyss. Mark, seeing his friend disappear into the void, reacted instantly. He began his descent, carefully climbing down the treacherous rock face. Below, George was gasping, his breath shallow and erratic. When Mark reached him, he could see the severity of the injuries. His friend was in a dire state. Blood seeped from a gash running from George's mouth to his chin. His limbs were at unnatural angles. His breathing was strained, his body trembling with shock. Mark knew they had no time to waste. He looked up at Melissa, and all it said was that they needed help. Making the hardest decision of his life, Mark turned and began the arduous climb back to the surface. Every minute mattered. George's condition was deteriorating. His body was shutting down, his consciousness slipping in and out like a flickering light. Melissa stayed by his side, speaking softly, keeping him tethered to reality. The cave pressed in around them, silent and unmoving, as George fought to stay alive. Above ground, Mark burst from the cave entrance, lungs burning, legs shaking from exertion. He sprinted to the car, driving at breakneck speed to the South Wales Caving Club, where he knew experienced rescuers were on standby. The alarm was raised immediately. Within an hour, a specialized cave rescue team was mobilized. Equipped with medical supplies, climbing gear, and stretchers, they descended into the darkness. The passage was narrow, wet, and treacherous. Every second counted. They knew that if George was to survive, they had to move fast. Meanwhile, below, Melissa did everything she could to keep George conscious. His face was pale, his lips trembling, his body racked with pain. The journey down had taken over an hour. Getting out, with his broken body strapped to a stretcher, seemed impossible. He fought against the fear, clinging to the sound of Melissa's voice, the dim glow of her headlamp illuminating the darkness. The first rescuers arrived 2 hours after Mark had sounded the alarm. Their voices echoed through the cavern, a beacon of hope in the oppressive blackness. They found George barely clinging to consciousness, his breathing ragged, his body dangerously cold. Assessing his injuries, they knew the extraction would be excruciatingly slow. Carefully, they stabilized him, ensuring his fractured limbs were immobilized before attempting to move him. The stretcher was maneuvered into place, but the passageway was so tight, they had to pass him through inch by inch. At times, rescuers had to squeeze through narrow gaps ahead of him, lifting and shifting the stretcher over jagged rocks, all while ensuring his broken body remained stable. Outside, additional rescuers and medical personnel prepared for his arrival. The hours dragged on. The rescue team took shifts, ensuring no one was too exhausted to maintain their grip. The deeper sections of the cave required precise rope work, each movement carefully calculated, each foothold tested and retested. It took over 24 hours. By the time George emerged into the cold, damp air of the cave's entrance, dawn was breaking. His body was battered, his face barely recognizable beneath dried blood and swelling. But he was alive. George was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent multiple surgeries. His jaw was reconstructed, his ribs healed over time, and his leg, though severely damaged, was saved. The recovery was long and arduous, but he survived.